My name's Ron Rhew. I live in Multnomah County in Oregon, east of the Sandy River. So we're kind of on that little skinny part that starts going up the gorge. So we're right on the west side of the gorge. In terms of getting started, I think the Gemini missions, I think, were in the 60s. And as a child growing up then, that captivated, I think, almost every kid that I know of. So starting then, I got an interest in science right away, and I read a lot of books about rocketry, etc., and Werner von Braun and things like that. At the same time, my dad's was career military. He was, I think at the time, a sergeant first class, and he was a game warden on Fort Knox. I grew up initially, part of my childhood was in Fort Knox. Gaffey Heights was they had these really large housing spaces for the troops, and we were in Gaffey Heights. To the north of us was Pritchard Place. Across the road from us was the Gold Vault. So the Gold Vault was right near my house. We drove past it all the time. I think they filmed Goldfinger while we were living there. So that we probably saw stuff flying around and didn't know what the heck was going on. But Pops was the chief game warden on Fort Knox, and my brother and I, we couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 years old. He used to take us with us, and their big thing was they propagated, unfortunately, not native birds, but exotic birds, released them on the base, because the base is an armor base, so it's huge. I mean, you can imagine you don't want tanks and mortar rounds and stuff going off close to population. So the actual military reservation is quite huge. My brother and I would go take these nets and catch pheasants and stuff and put them back in the pens. So, and then he was involved quite a bit with hunting and things like that on the reservation, being a game warden. So that kind of started me down this path on the wildlife aspects of it. So science, rockets, wildlife, and I think any science at that point, because at that point we had a society that really revered scientists and scientific discovery. So Sputnik and all this stuff's going on. And I think almost every child was wrapped up in some aspect of that. So time went on, we moved, not many times, but he moved us once, actually. So I grew up in this small town in Kentucky, outside of Fort Knox. And after I left home after graduation, came back, there was nothing to do. There was no jobs. My brother and I went out looking every day, looking for work, driving all over the place, couldn't find anything. So I told him I'm going to join the Coast Guard. And he's like, "You mean you're just going to check it out?" I said, "Nope." It's like, "You've been with me. There's no jobs." So, and they had at the time an oceanographic program. That was the only armed forces that had an oceanographic program. This is at the end of the Vietnam War. So Nixon's going on trial in the summer. In that fall, I joined the Coast Guard. And I didn't get my guaranteed school. So I had to, as kind of a roll of the dice, I had to declare that I wanted the Marine Science Technician School. So went to boot camp in Alameda, California. First time I had ever seen the ocean, being from Kentucky. And got my first duty station, which is in the Gulf of Mexico, on a cutter down there, which was, again, beautiful. I had no idea in how warm it was and everything, and tropical there along the coast. So I was a seaman there, went through a whole bunch of storms in the Gulf of Mexico, a couple of hurricanes. The ship I was on notoriously broke down, so we occasionally have to get towed back to port by another Coast Guard boat because we couldn't keep the engines running. But then I got my marine science school, went to Yorktown, Virginia, completed that. And then that involved a lot of meteorology. We did our own chemical analyses of water, and went to my first ship as a marine science technician was the Coast Guard cutter Chase out of Boston. So what we were doing there was primarily, well, we took on any kind of university research that they wanted us, if our track line took us past places they wanted to sample. So occasionally we'd have to, be trained on different types of sampling equipment, et cetera, et cetera. But mainly what we did was monitor currents, because at that point they were still tracking icebergs. I think post Titanic, trying to track where icebergs are going. So we were monitoring where the Gulf Stream meets the Arctic current coming into it and going up. So we do these transects across using a device that has an unfortunate name. It was called an STD, which it stands for salinity, temperature, and depth. So not the normal STD you would think of. So, and then we also did XBTs, which were expendable bathythermographs, and they would actually give you a profile of the temperature as the probe went down through the water. So that was primarily it. We took water chemistry samples, did our own titration, did oxygen levels, things like that. Still doing science. Bottom fell out of that. Their marine science program kind of dropped off. I got out. There was no way I was staying, and had my 4 years of GI Bill coming. So I went to school. Again, I decided to focus on wildlife. Well, the only school in Kentucky that did wildlife was Eastern Kentucky University. So I completed most of my degree there, which was kind of fun because I did botany and fish and all kinds of things, but that area is like a faunal relic area because the last glaciation pushed down right to that edge. And so everything kind of re-radiated back out from that Columbia Plateau. So that the diversity of plants and animals was pretty extreme there. We had to have, for example, a fish collection of 100 species. There aren't even 100 species of fish in Oregon. So that gives you an idea. Well, there probably is if you count all the marine species, but just looking at freshwater, nothing close to that. So then working for natural resources agencies, you had to kind of pay your dues, and paying your dues meant you're doing work you didn't really get paid much for. So it's like all you could really hope for was to make enough money to pay for your meals and et cetera, et cetera. And I had, at the time, I actually had started a family. So on top of just trying to provide for myself, I had a family to provide for. So I worked for Kentucky Nature Preserves doing vegetation surveys in the forest, and then also helping with fish surveys all across the state. It was really, really fun work, didn't pay anything. But in terms of really sort of cementing what you want to do, it gave me, the opportunities to kind of try a couple of different things and see what I liked. Anyway, went from there to, I started working for the BLM as a summer position doing range soil vegetation inventory. So I was back to plants again, and this was in Wyoming, up in the high desert. And it was, I don't know, the first time I'd been pretty much, other than Alameda, on the ground in the west, and that area is base elevation's about 6,000 feet. So, I mean, and the wind blew constantly, the tips of your ears were constantly sunburned. And we were doing these soil vegetation surveys all over the state. It was very, very interesting, some of the places, because we were hiking into, they just took us out in a bunch of travel trailers and dumped us. And we did 10 days on, 4 days off, and we did 10-hour days. And so you'd have a map, an orthophoto quad, walk out and do your transects. In some places found these old badland areas, and I was basically all over that western edge of Wyoming, up into the Ferris Mountains a little bit too. So after that, I finished my degree in University of Idaho, and that was in wildlife with a aquatics option. So I kind of kept this fisheries bent kind of going. Took a job with Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, working on a research project on Lake Koocanusa. Got hired by them to stay on. They thought we were still in the paying the dues portion of your career, as Montana sort of didn't pay enough, really. I couldn't afford to live there based on the salary I had. So I got called back from a professor that I had at University of Idaho, asked me if I wanted to do a master's degree. And I, of course, saw that where I was at was going to be a dead end, jumped at that opportunity, went back to grad school, incidentally made more money going to grad school with the remaining GI Bill than I made working for the state of Montana. I enjoyed that tremendously. I focused on aquatic insects, but entomology, just the range of behaviors you can attribute to insects is phenomenal. Almost any time, what I found with a degree in biology is knowing what's going on out there in terms of plants, what chemicals, what hormones, photoperiods, what wind has to do with it. Same with insects. They're so tightly tied to the environment. What it gives you is this really deep understanding of, I think, how miraculous all these pieces fit together, how many different processes, small, minute changes in chemicals and photoperiod, slope, aspect, everything has how much that's all intertwined to create this life you look at when you look outside your window. And I've talked about this several times. It's like people keep looking for miracles. All you have to do is look out the window. The whole thing is miraculous, really miraculous, how everything works together, how there's this ebb and flow between prey and predator and plant and herbivore. It's just, the whole thing is truly miraculous. And that I think has kept me going to this point. And then you throw a couple of grandkids into it. In my work doing my master's degree focused on, I was doing pollution research. So we sampled, my study areas were actually on the Nez Perce tribal area on their reservation. And we had a big storm, so we went out and sampled just because we knew they were there, sampled DDT and DDT analogs. And we had like a 50, 60-year event. We found DDT analogs in every sample we pulled. This impressed on us how widespread the contamination from past activities, even though it was banned, it was very persistent in the environment. And some of the breakdown byproducts are worse than the initial compound. And we did not find it. We found it in every sample. We read later that the state environmental quality had sampled and found some, and then they recanted, saying they didn't. And we're sitting right there on the information knowing, yes, they did find it. So that, I think, in terms of solidifying a fear of where we were taking environmental conditions for future generations, knowing this went on, and this, in some cases, big money, big ag kept even results of the state's own gathered information from coming to the forefront, so it could actually be, I don't know if you can effectively deal with it. There isn't a whole lot you can do, but at least being aware that it's there is somewhat helpful. And then points toward the practices that are contributing this. So that kind of focus on me is why it's so important, because of the damage we've done and the lack of care we put into treating this miracle that's outside of our door, not appreciating what's there, not truly understanding what's going on, and feeling obligated somehow or empowered to ignore it based on, pretty much most of the time it comes down to money and greed. And so money, greed, environmental degradation, these are the things that make me fear for my kids, my grandkids, and future generations. And it's been, I think, part of my career has been to kind of fight money and politics in some cases to try to make things better. So working with the Fish and Wildlife Service, I worked for OSU for a while as the only fish biologist at one point in the College of Forest Engineering, doing fish forestry research. So I got to see forest activities, I surveyed a lot of streams all up and down the Oregon coast. You got to understand that pretty well. Took the job with Fish and Wildlife Service, and I was doing endangered species work. So that involved pretty much all the other parts of the state. So everything from the Willamette Valley to far southeastern Oregon, down at the McDermott border with Lahontan cutthroat trout. I did listings, I did recovery plans, I did what's called interagency consultation, where we look at agency actions and determine what their likely impacts are and decide what best courses to take to try to minimize those impacts. Same with the whole Columbia Basin hydropower system. When we listed bull trout, I was on the team listing that. And later, I was leading the consultations for all the land management plans for BLM and the Forest Service with a team of other people. So everything from basically the crest of the Rocky Mountains, the Continental Divide, all the way to the Pacific coast, and then all the dams and federal projects from the same area all the way up the Pacific. So in one sense too, I think part of my master's degree, I did geographic information systems work, looking at how pollution actually flows across the landscape and gets into the stream so I developed my own digital elevation models, ran some non-point source pollution models through there. What it ended up training me to do was these large scale evaluations of diverse activities across the landscape. So all these things just start somehow weaving themselves together. All these experiences you've had and all these things you've tried and looked at just start weaving themselves into giving you this ability to look at things and to know not to take yourself too seriously, and know there's a lot of experts out there and they're more than willing to talk to you. And that kind of is how I ended my career. I was doing mostly habitat restoration for listed salmonids, so primarily NOAA species, but that was in Southeast Washington. And I supervised the fish passage program for that area for the Fish and Wildlife Service, which didn't amount to much because there wasn't much funding. We laughed at it all the time because they would tell us that we got $10 million nationwide for fish passage. We know that we do a culvert, it's going to cost $1 million. So it's like, what are you going to do with 10? It's like, that's really not going to take you too far. So I worked with this good friend of mine, Amy, and we cobbled together basically all of our restoration programs. And she primarily, working with her, we wielded them as one program. And in that case, we actually had enough funding that we could actually implement projects with partners and do a pretty good job with it. So immediately after I retired, I was no longer held by the Hatch Act. So I could be involved in political activities without breaking the law, essentially, which, if you notice, people are sort of breaking the law constantly left and right now. that was really poo-pooed upon when I was in. You did not engage in anything that was partisan. So that got me involved locally, politically, with new groups of people. And out of that sprang the OCERA starting in that aspect. And while I was simultaneously kind of organically developing and with several other groups. So my exposure was there with the Democratic Party. And needless to say, with my background and my grandkids looking at me, there was no way I wasn't going to do as an activist anything and everything possible to try to protect their lives and futures and future generations, which I think in a way almost seems selfish. And then I think back on it, and it's selfless. We really have to. It isn't. It boils down to what we're talking about with this is protecting people's lives from any kind of either overaction or underaction by primarily this government entities. And that's not even touching. It does touch, it's related to preserving the natural environment, but it isn't directly using that as a cause. It's mainly the human health aspects that we're looking at. So in that regard, it's going to, just those activities alone, knowing how intertwined we are in this web of life with everything else, it can't help but protect the environment at the same time. So I think it's very empowering for all the Oregon's citizens. Actually empowers the citizens, kind of starts countering the greed and empowering the citizens, particularly where their own health and livelihood and those of their children and future generations are concerned. So that's kind of what my motivation is. Long story. Oregon's a pretty unique place and has some pretty unique people, having traveled all across the state. And I worked extensively with the ranching community in Eastern Oregon and logging towns all over the place too. In the Willamette Valley in particular, the little fish that I was involved with listing, preparing the final rule for, was the Oregon chub in the Willamette Valley. And at the time we listed it, it was basically had declined by 98% of its range. So we're looking at 2% of this endemic fish persisting in the Willamette Valley. And so it got listed as endangered, which throws a few more hoops in the way. But I started working with the state Fish and Game, Paul Scheer, and the Native Fish Project, and working on getting different restoration activities in place. And part of our strategy was to establish stable populations of these that were genetically could interchange and keep the thing from getting through a genetic bottleneck anyway. So in terms of Oregon, here's the special part. We had landowners step up from almost the very beginning and offer to allow us to place an endangered species on their property. Now, at the same time, this is right in the middle of all the spotted owl wars that were going on. So here, in the middle of all these battles with everybody defaming the Endangered Species Act, et cetera, here are these farmers and ranchers in the Willamette Valley inviting us to put a listed endangered fish on their property. Of course, we had agreements with them that we need to have some assurances that if you're going to start changing the way you manage the area, we would need to have some prior knowledge of that and be able to move them if necessary to help preserve them. Most all people were okay with that. The state marched on doing the studies, doing the surveys, finding them in other places, getting other agreements with other landowners. So by and large, this is Oregon. In Nevada, we have like desert pupfish and things like that are down there. And the main worry there is somebody's going to take a bottle of bleach and throw it in the only habitat listing for this fish, right? You go up to Oregon, we got people okaying us, asking us or saying they have available suitable habitat to put endangered fish in. So primarily, that's a testament to the people of Oregon. And what I see that is those are our citizens there. That's their environmental ethic. I see for Oregon, OCERA, the people's right to a healthy environment, helping to restore a balance to that so that we're no longer caving in constantly to big timber, big ag, big petrochemical, whatever else you want to throw at it, which we know we're going to get thrown at us. But I see this as being a place where the inherent ecological values that I saw in Oregonians can be more fully expressed. And I don't think there's anything to fear. I think that some of the main problems we're dealing with, or we're going to have to deal with, the solutions all involve actually making everything better in terms of the productive capacity of the land, the ability of the water cycle to reestablish this secondary loop that's pretty much been eliminated that will help with our water supplies almost across the board. Reduced input ag, that's going to benefit the farmers. So these are the kinds of things and activities we need to help preserve our environment. They're not the kind of things that may be triggered by this act or not, but hopefully by allowing the citizens to more fully express their concerns for the environment, we can start moving in this direction, which I think holds more promise than anything else if we really embrace it and start looking at how we employ these practices, how we develop new techniques, say like for recycling. Say not because of this act, but decide that no plastic should be able to be put in a landfill. If you don't have a plan for recycling your packaging, you're not going to produce it. That's going to spur all this work into finding new ways to recycle these resources that should be thought of as renewable, that we think of as disposable. So I think for Oregon and for the region, I see that as kind of the Pacific Northwest and kind of fulfilling that ideal of us as being a very environmental area, or very green area.